Hello, I'm Felicia Jackson.
And I am Giulia Bottaro.
Welcome to Shake and Not Burn. Every day we're bombarded with headlines of crisis and disruption, from climate shocks to inequality to AI upheaval.
But behind the noise are choices, patterns, and opportunities. What we need is sustainability literacy, the clarity and confidence to interpret complexity, see trade-offs, and make decisions.
Our podcast goes beyond the headlines to uncover how real people are tackling change and what we can learn from them.
You can use these ideas to stay steady, even unshakable, in a world that feels uncertain.
This is Shaken Not Burned. Hello and welcome back to Shaken Not Burned, the podcast that looks beneath the buzzwords to explore how we really go about building a sustainable future. Today we're going to talk about something we actually rarely stop to question: the pictures and images that define how we understand sustainability itself. We started years ago with images of polar bears on melting ice. We've had AI-generated utopias. And today our guest, Dr. Rebecca Swift from Getty Images, is going to talk about how visual culture shapes what we feel, what we fear, and what we're able to act on. So Rebecca, welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks for having me.
I'm very excited about today. I think this could be a really, really interesting thing. One of the areas that is fascinating about sustainability is the level of cliche that we associate with it. So could you talk to me about why some images become so iconic in sustainability storytelling, and then perhaps how they lose their position? Because I'm thinking the image of the polar bear on melting ice was so iconic for so long and has become a cliche, yet the image of the Earth from space has become one of those moments that really captures the uniqueness of what we have in the interconnectedness of life on Earth.
The thing about something like sustainability and all of its connected themes, like the environmental, concerns and sustainability as a broader subject, is that it's actually too big for us to really to think about as individual humans. And I think the blue marble image was such a defining moment in the environmental campaign, because it really pictured for the first time something that showed that we are not huge, we are actually quite small in the grand scheme of things, and more importantly that we are something that we should be taking care of and protecting. And I think the converse has happened now, whereby climate change, as seen through melting ice caps, is too big. It's too much to contemplate. And so we know that we can make a connection between the visual of the polar bear on the ice cap to what we're supposed to think and feel in that moment, which is the Earth is getting hotter and we should be doing something. But the gap between kind of seeing and doing is almost getting bigger, because we are being bombarded with images of the impact of climate change, but we're not bombarded so much with the images of climate solutions, or how we might do, or how we might kind of change the trajectory that we're on. And we've seen periods of time where we're told to stop using plastic straws. Straws are going to save the planet, or stop using plastic bags. And we as consumers, as individuals, the 7 billion of us, are given these very specific things that we need to do to help the climate. To help the world, help the environment. But I think what we're starting to appreciate now, and especially as a kind of a creator of visuals, is that actually it's the bigger organizations, my world brands and companies. How do they use imagery to talk about the work that they're doing, rather than using kind of conceptual image, which is essentially what the polar bear is. It's a conceptual image that captures the notion of sustainability and climate change in one single image.
There's a thing that sort of leaps out to me there, which is there's always been this discussion about how the fossil fuel industry has sort of created this situation where individuals feel responsibility for action on climate change. But what we're talking about with this disconnect really is what people are made to feel. So whether that's a feeling of powerlessness because they can't actually manage to do anything, or whether it's for that feeling of being empowered, that they can actually achieve change. I'm interested in how brands can go about capturing feelings in images in a way that really communicates successfully to their audience what they're doing and why they're doing it.
And I think that's what every brand is trying to do, is to capture an emotion and to resonate with their audience. But I think what most brands don't do is resonate with negative emotions. I can't remember the last time I sat down with a brand manager and they said, I really want to connect with their feeling of powerlessness, or I really want to connect with with this feeling of shame. The best advertising actually is where you're talking to that behavior and understanding that how we as humans think and how we act, and using that in a positive way. I think there's a really great kind of slightly recent example in Spain. It was in the Madrid metro, and it was JC Deco. And I think it was a reforesting company who created this entire campaign, out of home campaign, on posters on the underground, where essentially it was do better than Jimmy. And it was essentially, you can do better than this person who is really not doing a good job in terms of their kind of sustainable consumption. Right. So it was like really playing into this kind of human need to compete or be better than or feel better than, just to kind of go back to your point about the feelings. And I just thought that was quite a clever campaign, in that, yeah, I'm more likely to react to that than being told by a hotel that all other guests reuse their towels, and therefore I must. It kind of flipped it on its head, and I thought that was a really nice way of thinking about this.
One of the things that I think is interesting there, as you say, is that it's about using a very human emotion, because one of the challenges about hotels saying, well, other guests are they're keeping their towels for 2 days, is that any normal person knows that it's also cheaper for a hotel not to wash its towels any day. There is an issue around underestimating the common sense of a lot of people. And whenever a brand is communicating to you in a way that feels like they're talking down to you, that's not going to work. And that feeling of condescension in many ways connects to this idea of cliches. What are the cliches that, well, to be blunt, that brands should be avoiding? Because if audiences are tired of cliches, what are the most overused tropes?
In this space, it is in that kind of conceptual area. Does tend to be the hands holding a planet or a globe, going back to the blue marble, but in many different colours, usually green. Using just green as a colour, trees and leaves and grass around a piece of communication is another one. Wind turbines, lots and lots of wind turbines.
Really?
Oh, yeah. And the thing about wind turbines is they photograph fantastically, they film fantastically, because people have issues with them being near their back garden, but they are incredibly graphic and they look great against a blue sky. They look great against a green hill. These are the things you're kind of thinking about as a visual person. Probably solar panels would be my
I do see a lot of those.
Yes, yeah. Fields of solar panels. Again, cinematic, epic, visually striking as a kind of an icon of sustainability.
We as consumers have a very strong visual language. We're surrounded by media. We've learnt how music gives us an indicator of what's about to happen in a film. We know what the picture should look like. We understand all this shorthand. So with your mention of the Spanish Metro advertising campaign, you talked about how using a different approach can change the way in which people react. So using a sort of human factor there. But this brings me back to this image issue. Because we have the shorthand, we do understand things without even noticing we're understanding them. Show us a picture and we've got all this background. What are the kinds of images that could make people lean in the same way that the campaign saying just be a bit better than Jimmy would make people feel?
We've kind of seen this shift anyway, that kind of peak of sustainability 2006, 2008. We did see a shift more towards kind of individual action, real life activities rather than this big whole world kind of conceptual imagery. I think where we're getting to now, and certainly what we have discovered in our more recent research, is that there's been this shift towards the things that businesses are doing, which are very, very specific. So whether it's investing in a certain type of technology, whether it's doing something different in a manufacturing process, but photographing that in a stunningly beautiful way, and really kind of going into the detail of that, not pretending that you are saving the planet by moving towards net zero in the year 2050 or whatever. It's thinking about kind of how you as a business are thinking about and embedding it into your packaging, embedding it into the way that you are moving things from place to place. It's pretty public that Amazon's carbon emissions have actually risen in the last year, but you can also see where they have moved to more sustainable packaging in how they deliver things to you on almost a daily basis.
Yeah.
And I certainly wouldn't use Amazon as the great example of sustainable practices, but broadly across all industries, it very much is in that specific. Being honest about what you are focusing in on and what you're not focusing in on. Being honest about the fact that it's a journey, to use a cliche, but it is, it's something that it can't be solved in 5 years or 10 years. It has to be something that is worked on long term, and show that investment and that connection to the environment in that way, which is, that sounds a little bit intangible and ephemeral, but I think that's where you have to have those conversations internally, and you have to have that kind of brainstorm around, okay, let's not go the route of what we've been doing for the last 20 years. Let's not go the route of, some of these kind of other businesses that are using these cliches, and let's really make this about who we are as a business and what we're doing. Because I think the one thing that we have discovered is that, and you've already mentioned this, but there is more expectation from consumers that brands are doing something. If you're part of a professional organisation and you're putting yourself out there, you should be doing something. And to not talk about it is just as dangerous as talking about it
that's that whole discussion
way
of green hushing and people not talking about things because they're nervous about backlash, because we've had all the ESG backlash. Where this gets really interesting to me is that's what you're talking about in terms of brands being expected to be specific about what they're actually doing today. Is it's really mirroring what's happening in a lot of sustainability moves generally within a business, not just on the imagery front, because there is a recognition that actually what you want to know is, well, what are you doing today? What are you doing specifically? So that issue of authenticity and transparency is becoming increasingly important. Now, one of the things that connects to that, and I think this probably relates to your research that came out earlier this year, and I will add a link to it in the show notes.
Thank you.
Is what surprised you most about the emotional response of audiences? Because the images we used to be driven by this idea of fear and urgency. We've got to do it immediately. And for me, the urgency thing never really came across properly, because you're saying it's urgent, but you're also saying, well, we're going to do this by 2050. And they just don't make sense. I'm back to the common sense of the consumer point. So what surprised you most?
I think what surprised me most, actually, where we've kind of looked at this messaging, is that actually humour and irreverence works really, really well. And I was really surprised by that, because I expected to be very worthy and, incredibly serious and fact-based. Everything needs to be evidence-based. But actually, a humorous message or a bit of levity in the message, that doesn't necessarily downgrade the message in any way, but actually being able to laugh with your audience about kind of where we are in terms of green hushing, greenwashing or whatever, is actually a breath of fresh air. And that really tracks well with people, all age groups. There are certain types of sustainable images that tend to work better with older generations versus younger generations, but something like humour in sustainable imagery works really, really well.
That's fascinating.
And that is a surprise.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not necessarily surprised that imagery would need to be different between the different generations, but I do like the fact that humour is something that can cross those generations. One of the things that interests me there is the extent to which cultural differences rather than demographic differences actually shape the imagery that works for sustainability. So, is there a difference between what might resonate in Europe or the US or the global South?
Interestingly, sustainability is a big subject, and again tracks really, really well in places like South America. The countries there are kind of opening up and are really thinking about the landscape around them, just to kind of generalize about an entire continent. But there you go. But I think the biggest shift of which we are still tracking, and I can't predict how this is going to pan out, is the shift we've seen in the US and the lack of desire to stick their head, brands who stick their head above the parapet. We've seen some examples of brands who have really had, had issues online because of claims that they've made, and I think a lot of that is a desire to do good, but also the climate that we're currently in there in the US is creating difficulties and a lot more anxiety. Whereas I think in Europe we have typically, especially places like Germany and Scandinavia, where there have been very clear sustainability policies and regulations happening, there is a lot more expectation and a need to be communicated to in a way that very much promotes Green's credentials.
So would it be fair to say that dependent on the country you're in or promoting your brand in, you'd have to take a completely different approach? Because
yes,
your level of that market's level of understanding and expectation around sustainability will shape the images that you should or shouldn't use.
Yeah, and I think that's probably why we end up with this kind of generic, conceptual, cliched imagery. If you're a brand that's talking to a global audience, then where do you pitch your kind of level? It points to the importance of understanding local culture and local audiences better, and using that knowledge to connect to connect in the right way.
I have a question that springs from the advent of AI, because obviously the challenge if you're a global brand is you want to have quite straightforward messaging so you can manage it. But if you've got AI, can you not generate these different images appropriate for different markets? I mean, I suppose that then connects to the issue about trust and fear around AI. So I suppose there's a twofold question there. Does AI help you in shaping the imagery and the message that you use in different markets? But at the same time, has it changed what people trust or what people expect from visual storytelling?
Oh, there's so much to unpack there. So first of all, there is a major issue with trust in AI imagery. There's an expectation in many countries and in many industries that AI imagery is labelled as such. I have not seen any data to this point where consumer feelings about an image is improved when they know it's an AI image. Let's just put it like that. It tends to have an incredibly negative effect. We've seen brands, again, who have been called out for using AI imagery. So there's a nervousness on the part of the brand. There's the distrust on the part of the consumer. Now, putting all of that aside, if we lived in an ideal world where there was, we could all do exactly what we wanted to do with no consequences.
I'm not sure that sounds like a great world. We seem to be having that in certain places already.
That's true. But the AI is trained on imagery that's on the, it's scraped for the internet. We all know that. The problem with the content that's on the internet is that sustainability and climate change has been represented visually in a very kind of narrow way in the last 25 years. So the amount of content, the proportion of content that can talk to the things that we now need to talk to when we're talking about sustainability is not in the models. And so you might end up with something crazy and cool, which is, obviously very attractive to some people. But if you want to get to everything we've talked about so far, authenticity, the honesty around what you're doing, AI is not going to help you get there. And then the third point, AI is ridiculously bad for the environment in terms of the amount of water it needs to cool the servers and blah, 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 blah. So in whichever direction you come at this, it's bad. It's bad content. It's bad for the environment, and you're talking about the environment, and your customers are not going to trust you by using that content. It's a very brave CMO that uses uses AI to talk about sustainability.
You've made 3 very good points there about why that's not the route to take. But then the flip side of that is, if you're talking to brands or if potentially you're briefing a photographer, how do you define authentic? What does honesty in an image really look like?
Yeah, that's the question, and I think honesty is something different to everybody, and I think we are moving into this highly fragmented kind of niche audience world, and what AI does allow you to do is to talk to lots of different audiences at once in lots of different ways. So in many ways that the AI has helped that happen. So translating messages into lots of different languages, creating localized packaging, dropping that into the photo, that's highly that's acceptable in for consumers. That's not that's not the same as generating an entire image. So yeah, it does help you in that way. But I think the honesty and trust part, it has to come from the company itself. It has to come from within. And there's, it's thought and creativity and effort. This is a difficult thing to talk about. It's a difficult thing to visualize. And, I've spent 20 years working out how to visualize it. I know it's not easy, but then getting it right it's got to be an amazing sense of achievement when you do get it right.
That sounds right.
Yeah, put the effort in.
Yeah, I like the call. Now, one of the things that brings me to is the idea of how imagery is one of the ways, I suppose, it both reflects and shapes culture. So I'm really interested in your perspective on if we found a way to create authentic imagery and authentic messaging around sustainability, when we change what sustainability looks like, do we actually start to change what societies believe is possible?
Yeah, I think imagery is one of those things that has the ability to do that, to change minds, change hearts, change the way we feel about things. And we've seen, we have seen moments in history. We talked about the blue marble, we talked about the polar bear. I think, seeing Greta Thunberg sitting outside on a Friday in 2018 changed the way we felt about climate change again. And it completely resurrected, I think, for a lot of people, the emotions and feelings around, okay, well, what do we do about this? That kind of call to action that she very much presented to the UN. And also this idea of somebody so young who was willing to kind of, put that effort in. And
back to putting the effort in.
Exactly.
Whether you're a brand or a child.
And so the visualization of Greta became iconic. And then we started to see, a lot more focus on young people and young women in particular who were thinking about climate. And that then became iconic for sustainability and climate change. And it's those kind of moments in time that really force the visual language onwards, as far as I can see. And that's where you can not only raise awareness, which obviously she did, but then you start to create action off the back of that awareness. So, using similar imagery, reminding people of that visual, and again, giving them more visuals in their memory bank that they can go back to and and eventually, hopefully, fingers crossed, create some action out of that. I think that's it's important to have those icons, but out of those icons come lots of different variations, which then move things forward.
I suppose where this sits for me in the idea of culture is this sense that if you can see something, you believe it to be possible. So you open up a whole world of possibilities on how you might move the system forward or the culture forward or whatever it might be. But one of the challenges you have with sustainability, if we're honest about it, is that individuals really only have control over the choices available to them. And often it's things like systems, like the energy system or the food system or the financial system, that are really those levers for change in sustainability. And they are really hard to visualize. I mean, I can tell you how hard it is to try and find a photo that's interesting to put at the top of a story about climate finance. How can we use imagery to make these invisible systems visible?
Yes, and I can actually, in my mind, as soon as you said climate finance, I can think of a number of images that we've created, but I've also images that I've seen that tend to be something along the lines of something green and then something financial put together. I mean, that's essentially it.
And I mean, it's not what you're looking for when you're trying to provide a catchy hook for someone who's looking online at news.
No. And I think that's why we end up with, especially with the systemic stuff, where we end up with end up with imagery that's either kind of impact focused or solution focused. So,
solar panels or a rice paddy.
Exactly. And I think, in DE&I work, there's a saying, you can't be it if you don't see it. And I think sustainability in many ways, all of the work around kind of representation of underrepresented communities is similar to sustainability. It's kind of a bit of a broad leap to make that connection, but it makes
a lot of sense because it is about visibility.
Yes, exactly. And it's getting to the right images. And I think the key thing is broadening the landscape, but not the landscape as in the scenery, but as in the visual landscape of this type of content. We've just relied on cliches for too long. It's been too easy. It's almost like when you click on a website and you see the chat bubble, that's the chat bot, and you click on, they become buttons almost. So, anything to do with ESG or sustainability is a tree, or it's a picture of the planet, or, it's been reduced down to buttons.
And that's damaging because change lies in nuance. And there's a huge difference between climate change or climate action and ESG. One is a compliance issue. It's a reporting issue. One is an existential threat, may change the way in which we live. So when you reduce it down to these simple things, to me, this is a complicated one, because on one level, I like the idea you can simplify an idea so it's easy to recognize. But at the same time, if you're lumping everything that needs to be done under one simple image, it's not necessarily helpful in telling you what this particular thing is about. And I think we are all used to this idea that we expect an image to tell us what we're getting when we move forward. Yeah, it's a really difficult one.
It is. And I wish I could come on to this podcast and give all the answers, but unfortunately I don't have them.
But at least we're having the conversation. And I think that's an important thing for anyone working in marketing or brand anywhere, is to remember to have this conversation internally. Because if you're not aware of all the difficulties associated with limiting the kinds of imagery you use, or the potential to open up channels of communication by using something different, then you're missing an opportunity.
Absolutely.
So you mentioned earlier humour as something that works really, really well. Often one of the things that's talked about is hope as a powerful emotional tool. But again, to a certain extent in sustainability, it's like relentless positivity. Does it always work? So what role do you think things like hope, positivity, sorry, I sounded a bit negative when I said those, because I was thinking about levity and joy as a much more positive way of engaging with that. How do you go about engaging in that way.
If the action is there and the activity is happening, then there is bound to be stories within that you can tell. And there is hope to be found, whether it's in something of the natural world or whether something of the human world. We've got photographers who are working in this field and thinking more in terms of planetary health. And I really like that as a concept in my brain in terms of how I might think about that creatively, because I feel like there's something in that connectivity that maybe hasn't been mined in the right way. And I'm going to use David Attenborough as an example. You can't have a conversation around the planet without David, but I am going to mention David. And I think his most recent film, Ocean, I thought that was really interesting because he has in his later years gone really hard on the sustainability messaging, or rather on the planetary health messaging. And what I loved about that film, and you can watch the trailer for it on YouTube, how he is actually going, well, actually there is hope. We have hope here. And that was such a moment for me anyway, and I don't know if other people felt the same way, but I thought, oh, David's telling me there's hope. There must be hope.
Well, I think that there was a wonderful survey of the English asking who they would trust most if there was going to be a nationwide broadcasting thing. And the number was ridiculous. It was like 90% of the population went, oh, David Attenborough, because he's just inspires trust and hope. And, and to me, this is, again, really interesting because he's sort of embodied that over the last however many decades. And that focus on hope is really, really powerful. Are there examples? And I know I keep coming back to imagery in a way that's kind of challenging because I recognize this is a really hard area. It's just I have no idea how to do it. So I'm really interested in your take on it. But are there images that you can think of that we would respond to in a way that inspire confidence, in the way that we believe we believe what David Attenborough says? Are there images that represent that level of trust, or even something like collective agency or the power of people doing things together that's not a picture of a drawing of 8 people all holding hands?
Yes. Well, I think, just let's use the BBC as an example in the first instance. David Attenborough has been attached to the best cinematographers and the best photographers of wildlife in the world. And we have seen the beauty of nature through that amazing craft. And the latter series that he's done, you've seen how they do the work, which actually adds, to your point, trust to that content. And so he's sitting in a studio recording a voiceover. He's not in the field like those guys are. That I think is really important. But I think also we trust David because he's been doing this his entire life and he's really committed to this work. So
he seems to be one of the few experts that people who don't trust experts still trust.
Yes. Because we still remember him sitting in the jungle with gorillas, and even though he hasn't done that for decades, that's how we imagine him. So really, really well crafted stories that are the craft of storytelling as well as the story itself. I think that's really, really important, especially in this work. I think that's where you can create a trust in what you're doing. And then, in terms of activities or actions, has to be real, has to be authentic, can't be acted, can't be recreated. You can't fake it. That's you can't fake it. So and that again, I think this is all embedded in the fact that we are incredibly visually literate. We love as humans, we love aesthetic beauty. We love something that's beautifully created, but equally we trust something that feels inherently real
and a bit raw.
And a bit raw. And the hardest thing, I'm going to tell you this now, the hardest thing is to build that believability into an image.
Because that's something that really I struggle with this idea that where we're surrounded by political arguments and greenwash versus green hush and people trying to do things but getting it wrong and then getting into trouble, and everybody accusing each other of the wrong thing, and different groups having different agendas and wanting everyone to be perfect. How on earth do you communicate effectively? How do you signal that your visuals are about something credible and evidence-based? Because that's the problem. We need credibility, evidence-based decision-making. But how on earth do you communicate all of the complexity of that into an image?
Well, that's why you pay a company like us to do it for you. That's where we.
That's a fair enough answer.
That's where we add the value. Yeah. I mean, I think this is, to use a cliche term, you're not trying to boil the ocean, but you're not trying to solve all of the issues of the climate in your one communication. Really focusing on what's important to you, what's important to your company, what's important to your colleagues around you. And I think if you stay true to that, then that is what consumers pick up on, and that's what they start to really believe in. I think one of the brands that has the unique, because I don't think there's anyone else, the unique position of always being quoted as being a sustainable brand is Patagonia.
Of course.
And I wish I could think of other examples, but I think that absolute insistence on the messaging and sticking to what they truly believe in, that will create these things for you. They're so well made, you're never going to have to replace them. And that's part of the sustainability messaging. And I love that. And I wish more brands would do that, actually, because I think, and I mean, that's, that goes against all of planned obsolescence and the modern marketing and kind of,
well, this is what I meant about the fact that potentially a lot of the things we're facing are going to have to change the way in which we do things.
Mm-hmm.
And Patagonia is always an interesting example. It's quite frustrating when you're looking for examples, as you say, because everybody talks about them.
Yeah.
But one of the reasons for that is because they're so consistent and so cohesive.
Yeah.
It's not one message here and a different action there. When you start unpicking it all, it's consistent all the way through. And that brings me back to your point about being specific, about being local, because that aligns very strongly with a lot of the other things I'm seeing, which is this idea of people beginning to recognize that you can't address all these problems at once and you can't communicate them all at once. And actually, you need to talk to people where they are. You need to understand what their concerns are and how they can be made to feel different, or how they can take the way they're feeling and do something different with it. This brings me back to the culture idea, this idea of possible futures, and the idea that imagery isn't just about communication, it's about how we understand our possible futures. I'm going to ask two questions, one of which is, and I realise the obvious answer is to get in touch with you, but the non-obvious answer I'd be interested in hearing. What do you think sustainability professionals or brands can do today to shift their visual language towards impact, away from sort of just being green tokenism?
To go back to this kind of competitiveness, what are you doing that your competitors are not doing, or what are you doing better than your competitors? You don't have to pretend that you're perfect in terms of what you're doing, but what have you managed to kind of push ahead with and give yourself, you feel good about yourself. And I think that's the other thing. It's like, if you as a brand feel pride in something that you're doing, this isn't a marketing message, this is embedded in the values of your business, then that comes through. It comes through in the marketing that's put out into digital spaces. It comes through in terms of the interactions that consumers might have with your business, and that is long lasting and just runs deeper and more authentically, I think.
What I love about that is actually, again, if you're talking about pride, that's a very human thing.
Yeah,
it can be negative, it can be positive, but it's very, very human, and a really lovely way of thinking about a brand being authentic, which is, we're doing something we're really proud of. We want to talk about it, which I love.
Yeah.
And then I have a question which is, I'm quite sure, absolutely impossible to answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Oh, thanks for that.
Which is, if you could design the perfect image for sustainability, say for the next decade, as an indicator of where we should be, something that makes people believe that the change we need to see is possible, what would that look like, or what would it show?
I think if I knew how to do that, I would have done it already and made my fortune from it. I mean, for me, it's just anything where we start to see kind of nature taking back the planet in some way. Probably the most positive imagery that I've seen in recent years was during COVID. Where we started to see kind of nature coming back into urban spaces and where humans normally are. And, there was a lot of fakes around, but in general, there was some really interesting imagery. And certainly our photographers took some great shots of, sheep in town centres and, that kind of thing.
I remember seeing those.
Yeah.
They're amazing.
Yeah, in Wales. And I just think that to me is positive, and it's very specific again, but I think there is something in that.
Getting rid of that separation of the human from everything else, because we actually do exist within a system of nature.
Yeah, it goes back
you don't have an economy, you don't have a business if you don't have water and air and food and soil and that kind of thing.
Yeah, which goes back to the planetary health notion again. So yeah. Oh, maybe we've just solved it. There you go. Job done.
I like that. I wish I was a slightly more creative person, would be able to make something like that, but sadly not in my skill set.
Leave it with me. I'll see what I can do.
Excellent. I look forward to seeing that. Now, Rebecca, I've pretty much touched on all the things that I'm really interested in, but you are the expert here. What haven't we talked about that we should have done?
I think this is a really good conversation. It's very easy to talk about what's already happening and where we've come from. And I really enjoy looking back at how something like sustainability has been visualized in the past. But I think it is hard to have this conversation. From that point of view, I feel quite satisfied with which direction this conversation went.
I'm glad
for that exact reason. It's not, yes, we're not taking into consideration some of the kind of the commercial requirements of working in a business, like you say, ESG or whatever the latest thing is. Having to report on that. You started this conversation thinking about people's emotions and feelings, and I think that gets lost in talking about commercial visuals a lot of the time. When you're talking as a brand manager or a marketer, you think about images very differently to how you might when you're kind of looking through your own social media feed or consuming visuals in different ways. It's almost like we need to try and find a way to kind of cut that barrier down, because consumers don't think, they expect brands to talk to them in the same way, but with a level of professionalism and extra effort and craft and investing in creators to create content for them to see. I think
but in the end, storytelling is storytelling.
Storytelling is storytelling, and great storytelling is an art form. Serendipity happens sometimes, but in general, it is an art form, I think.
Well, that's a wonderful point on which to end our conversation. The reason I love talking to you in the first place, and the reason I think this conversation is so important, is that the images we're surrounded by do help shape what we think change looks like and whether or not we believe it's possible. So getting those images right is so important. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us today and helping us see sustainability in a new light. Join us next time on Shaken Not Burned, and don't forget to subscribe and like as we continue to explore the stories and the signals that define our shared future.